Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckham. My next guest is Toby Flinn. Toby went to Texas A&M where he was in the Corps of Cadets. After he graduated, he worked in construction for a short period of time, and then he spent almost a year traveling around the country, never once sleeping in a hotel. He found himself at the Washington, D.C. Memorial and decided that he had had enough traveling, and so he went back to Dallas and got in the construction industry. And then 9/11 happened. And within 2 months, Toby was in the Marine Corps. Toby served 3 tours of duty, twice in Iraq and once in Afghanistan. He is a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves now, and he is a husband and the father to 4 beautiful children. In the podcast, Toby and I talk a lot about his experiences wandering the country right after college, what it was like being in the Marine Corps, what it was like seeing people literally killed within 10 feet of him, what it was like going from the Marine Corps to the Army, and how Afghanistan and Iraq were different. Toby also has a lot of things to say about how he deals with anxiety, how he dealt with difficult situations, his thoughts on happiness, purpose, and how to live a good life. Toby is a true American patriot. He's a warrior. He's a philosopher. And he's just a damn good guy. I hope you enjoy this podcast. And now I give you Toby Flinn. Hey, everybody. Brian Beckham here. I got my good friend, a very, very close friend of mine, somebody I've known for over 25 years, Toby Flinn, on the podcast. Toby, it's great to see you, man. How you doing?
Good, Brian. Really good to see you. Thanks for having me.
You got it, man. Well, I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. You know, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that of all my friends and all the people I've met, I've always kind of looked up to you in a way, because you've always been not only a leader, but both in terms of being in the Marine Corps and fighting for our country and stuff, but you're a philosopher of sorts. You're a really smart guy, and when you say things, you probably have a lot of friends that say things, and you kind of you don't pay a lot of attention to. But I've always really paid attention to what you've said, because I've thought that you just have a really, really good way of looking at the world. But before we get into all the stuff with the Marine Corps and some of your thoughts on life and philosophy in general, how you doing, man? Everything going good?
We're doing great. Yeah, we're doing great. I'm in my home office, which is my garage. It keeps away from the kids, so it's a little warm in here. But
so
it's
that's
great.
A garage?
It is. Yeah. So this is my kind of backdrop when I have business meetings, and if you're to see the rest of it, you'd see a welder, you'd see a rogue gym setup, you'd see a lot of other things.
Well, that's great. Well, it looks good. So, I thought we were going to be kind of through the first wave of the pandemic, but it's kind of looking pretty bad in Texas right now. So how's the family doing? What do you got? 4 kids now? 5 kids? 6, 7?
4 kids.
4 kids.
4 kids. Yeah. So, we're all doing great. I think that Melanie had the brunt of it when the kids were in school, and the 8 and 6-year-old, she was teaching them.
Yeah.
The 13 and 11-year-olds were kind of on their own. And so, essentially summer started, March 17th, and it never stopped. In fact, when school was over, the kids were like, "It's over?" Well, yeah. They didn't even know what was going on.
Yeah. I was talking to a Methodist a pastor friend of mine a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. We were talking about homeschooling kids, and he had a couple really good lines. He said his wife told him, "If you catch me talking to myself, I'm having a parent-teacher conference, and I'm afraid I might get fired for drinking on the job." So, but
yeah,
the other thing he said is his kids are in college, and my kids, I have 3 basically teenagers now, 16, 14, and 12. You've got 2 teenagers and 2 kids that are a little younger, and that's a little harder, I think, a little more responsibility, right?
Yeah, it is. It is. But it's funny. The more kids you have, the more they kind of feed on each other, and then the more they entertain each other. So, as frustrating as they can be sometimes, all in the kitchen at one time, they're all friends. And
Yeah.
so, I'll tell you a funny story. They were probably the hardest part's been getting off the electronics because they're on the electronics for school. And then when they're off, there's nowhere to really go. And so I told Roman, who's kind of the young Aristotle, I said, Roman, if you don't get outside, I'm throwing you out and I'm locking the door. And he didn't flinch. He said, well, those are really good parenting skills. And he wasn't trying to sit, he wasn't doing it to be funny, but it was,
Yeah.
that's what it's been like.
So how has it been different for you guys? Because one of the things that I've been telling people, in my family, we took the quarantine very, very seriously for the first 2 months. And in a way, as bad as things were and as uncertain as everything was, in a way, at least looking at it from a positive perspective, I got to spend a lot of time with my kids, and so did my wife. And sometimes maybe a little bit too much, but it was, if you're going to look at things kind of from a positive standpoint, it has been an opportunity, at least for my family, to maybe grow a little bit closer. So have you guys had kind of
We
an
did.
experience like that?
Yeah, we had the same experience. We did. Less obligations too. We're not going to soccer practice, gymnastics, swim. We were kind of locked in, and so we weren't going anywhere.
Yeah.
Melanie and I are kind of ships passing in the night, many days out of the week as we're picking up, dropping off.
Yeah.
We always hit dinner, but it's pretty quick, and
Yeah.
so that was really nice to not have anywhere to go.
Yeah. So is Melanie working right now?
So she doesn't like me to use this word, but she's a blogger.
Why doesn't she like that word?
I don't know. I think it's the way I say it. She doesn't like it. And then she also
Do you put air
teaches.
quotes up when you say it?
I don't. It must be the way I enunciate it, and just a lot of things. But she also teaches a online course for a university in Louisiana.
And she's as I recall, her specialty is in nutrition, essentially.
She is, yeah. She's a dietitian, nutritionist and dietitian, yeah. So RD, registered dietitian.
And she's had that blog or website for for quite a long time now, right?
She has, yeah. I think she started it when we lived in Hawaii, and it's really been a good outlet for her.
And what's the address for the website?
It's nutritiouseats.com.
Nice.
Just like it sounds.
Awesome. So I'm glad to hear your family's doing well. It's been the last time I remember spending time with each other was Seattle. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I've still got some pictures from that trip. That trip it was a great start to the trip for me because I got to spend time with one of my best friends and his wife and his kids. And but I was going on an Alaskan cruise, and the trip took a downhill trajectory after that. I got notavirus the first day of the trip, so probably the highlight of my trip was hanging out with you guys.
Oh my goodness.
Well, Toby, so good to hear your family's doing well. So
likewise, you too, Brian.
You have you are a highly decorated Marine Corps officer, and I want to talk a lot about your experience in the Marines. But before we do that, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you grew up, where you went to school, things like that.
You bet. Born and raised in San Antonio, so come from a family that came over from Alsace-Lorraine in Germany, France, settled in Hondo, kind of Uvalde, Devine area, and went to Texas A&M after high school. So left for college and didn't come back to San Antonio to live until about 3 years ago.
And that's where you are now.
So we came back here when we came off of active duty.
Nice.
And yeah.
And then you were one of the, I mean, it almost seems like to me there should be a name for the group of guys and girls that you and I know who went to college and then graduated from college and then went into the workforce in some capacity, and then 9/11 happened. And there's a large group of people, including mutual friends of ours, Blake Sawyer. I had him on the podcast a while back. Same deal. And I'm always curious about, I mean, because that is it seems to me a pretty big life shift. I mean, once you're out of college and you're kind of getting settled into whatever you're doing professionally, to join the Marine Corps and go to battle is about as drastic of a change as I can possibly imagine. So tell us a little bit about, well, I'll tell you what, before we get into that, after you graduated from college, you were something of a wanderer, I guess is the way I would put it. Like, you know who I'm thinking of? I don't know if you saw this the other day in the news, but you remember the kid, Chris McCandless, who ultimately went to the Alaskan wilderness and died out there.
Right.
They just moved that bus out of Alaska. I don't know if you saw that.
No kidding.
Yeah, they helicoptered it out of there because apparently tourists were going up there and staying and having like all sorts of trouble. But anyway, I always think of you kind of that period of your life as kind of the Chris McCandless wandering around the country period. So tell us about after college, but before the Marine Corps, kind of what you were doing during that time.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I laugh when you said wonder because my sister and I, we have a kind of a secret joke when we see the bumper sticker that says all who wander aren't lost. And we kind of always look at each other and say, yes, you are.
Yeah.
You know, so leaving school, you know, we had some issues in the family, and so went straight into the workforce, paid off my school. That was my key priority, was get stable.
Yeah.
So I had to be self-sufficient. That was my number one goal. So went to work, paid off all my student loans, paid off all my debt, and then there was just so much that I wanted to see in the world. And was single at the time. I was being very I guess it was a time of kind of my formative years, you know, after college, where you kind of grow up and you're not distracted by all the social options that you have. And I decided that I needed to go see some stuff. And I originally had a very audacious, I mean, I had a plan that was to go around the world, but I kind of slimmed it down a little bit. But it started off going to be a river guide in Oregon. And there's some funny stories around that. But, you know, before I started this trip, there was a couple key things that I really kind of wrote down for myself. I said, I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to go party. You know, this isn't kind of a last hurrah before I get married, or you know, kind of a younger midlife crisis. And that was important to me because I wanted to make sure that I got all of it that I could out of it. And I did. You know, I did everything from wait tables in San Francisco, and stayed with a good friend of ours, Casey Fisher. Him and his wife just got newly married, and for some bizarre reason, they invited me to stay with them for about 3 months. We still laugh about what they were thinking.
What were they thinking? What were they thinking?
I don't know. But you know, and then I saw you in Las Vegas, I think at your bachelor party, and then I saw you, and I think, and also in Chicago. I think it was a Notre Dame A&M game, Brian.
Yeah, that's right. The way I remember that, Toby, is I've been married for 20 years now, and I was just starting to date the lady I'm married to, Kara, and we went up there for the A&M Notre Dame game and also to travel around a little bit. And you came and met us there. You were there for some. Yeah. I forget why you were there, but I remember seeing you there.
Yeah, I was just on my figure 8 of the United States. So, yeah.
So you go. So tell us, because this is super interesting to me. You kind of just glossed over this. You said there's some funny stories about being a riverboat guide or a river guide in Oregon. You can't just do that. You got to tell us a couple stories, man.
So, well, I mean, honestly, the funniest story is that, I mean, there's a lot of little ones that we could go on about, but, you know, the plan was to be a river guide, you know, for all summer. And so I went to the school, it was like a 2-week school, and got done. They hired me, you know, the first day, and they said, okay, you'll be staying in this house up in the hills in Oregon. I said, great, this sounds wonderful. So I go up to the house in Oregon, and it's beautiful. It's up in the timbers. You know, I mean, anything that's, you know, it's the area where moss grows on everything. I mean, it's so green it makes you sick.
Yeah.
But beautiful, right? Especially if you're from Texas. It's just overwhelming. And I walk in the house, and the first thing I see is all sorts of drug paraphernalia, marijuana paraphernalia. And I thought, this is going against the things that I said I was not going to do or even be around it. So, that night was a rough night because I thought, I think I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to have to kind of give up on this. I can't, this isn't why I decided to do this. It was kind of, and I don't think I could have articulated it so well then, but I was really kind of, looking at the contemplative life, finding truth in those things, although I don't think I could have said it as clearly then. But so I had to get up the next morning and leave. And so, I got hired one day, I worked one day, and then left the next morning. Just because it was not, it just wasn't going to be the right place. So
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Why were you surprised that a riverboat guiding company would maybe have a little bit of marijuana lying around? Yeah, that's
great question.
To me, it would be more shocking if you didn't see that, right?
Well, I think that's a good point too, because obviously there's not many people who have not been around that lifestyle, but I guess I expected to be a little bit more modest. Yeah. It was basically walking into a college dorm room again.
Yeah, and you I think it's fair to say you had about as full of a college experience as far as that goes as anybody.
Yeah. I would say starting in middle school, I probably had as full. When I tell stories about what I did in middle school to kids, they go, they wait for the punchline, and then I say, yeah, we did that in middle school, and they're they almost hit the floor.
Yeah. Well, so you're a river guide, and you have the job for one day.
One day, yeah.
And then that's it. So what did you do after that?
So then I had to decide what I was going to do. So I went to Seattle, and I decided I'm going to go to Alaska. I really want to see Alaska. And so I'm sitting in the Barnes and Noble back when we had bookstores, when that was the place to hang out, right? Having a cup of coffee. Again, the life was great. I had enough money in the bank to last me a year, no obligations, and sitting in Seattle, really, walking around the wharf, actually close to where you and I were. I was down there, and I said, well, I'm gonna go to Alaska. So I got the book on Alaska, and it's just goes to show you how kind of, how stupid you feel sometimes. I looked at the map, and Alaska is like 3,000 miles away from Seattle driving. And I thought, it
doesn't look like that far on the map. Yeah, that doesn't look like it's that far.
No, driving, it is that far.
But it's only about 3 inches on the map.
Yeah, because of the curvature.
Yeah.
But by boat it's closer. So once I say, well, that's going to be tough, and it's it's the Yukon Trail, and I didn't know if my truck was up for it. So then I decided, well, what am I going to do next? So then I decided I'm going to go find my friend Casey, who was living in Los Gatos, California, the Cats. Yep. And ended up staying with them for, I think, about 3 months. Took a waiter job at the Green Papaya Vietnamese restaurant, and I got to hang out with some Vietnamese folks for about 3 months in the back kitchen. So, and then after that it was a big figure 8. And I had got some interesting stories of waking up in Yellowstone with, a moose, with his head in my window. And I didn't stay in one hotel. My goal was not one hotel.
Really? So and how long were you doing this?
I think I was on the road for 9 months. And I'll never forget, Brian, I was in DC at the monument, seeing the Smithsonian. And it's like, when you've exercised or you've done something and you hit a wall, like it's something that you can't explain. It's both physical and mental. Your body just says you're done. And it wasn't that I was physically tired, but I was done. It was like Forrest Gump when he just stops running. I'm done.
What a great way to put it. Because everybody will remember that scene, because he just ran forever, and then all of a sudden he's just like, boom, I'm done. I stopped.
I'm done. Yeah. And I headed back to Texas.
So when we're going to talk about the Marines quite a bit, but before we get to that, because this is really a little bit of an Into the Wild story. A little bit. You say you did a figure 8, so you were in the northwest.
All the way up to Canada. And all that. So I've got a couple of funny stories on that. I'll never forget, I pulled into a kind of a feed store in Montana, and way up in the mountains. And I was just going to get a cup of coffee because I've been driving all night. And early in the morning, and I pull up, and I had remember that Toyota truck I had? It was a black old style Toyota truck, just
Yeah.
a normal, just a small truck. But if you remember back then, Texas license plates, they would say Texas truck if it was a pickup. And so on the license plate it said Texas truck. And I pulled up to this feed store, and next to me, it was probably a F-350 dually, a work truck, not the kind of trucks you see at an apartment complex. And this old codger gets out of the truck and, limping kind of leaning over to one side, and he walks out, and he looks at my license plates, and he looks at me, and he says, "So y'all call those trucks in Texas?" And then turned around and continued to march on to his business.
Yeah, that I can totally get that. So Northwest Canada, California, Montana, and you didn't stay in a hotel once in 9
Not
months.
once.
Where were you staying?
Either basically in the parks, in the park systems. So mostly in the parks. You'll find that it's actually really hard sometimes, though, when there's no parks, and you kind of get an understanding of what it might be like to be homeless. Meaning, let's say someone who's a professional but has lost their home. It's actually really kind of hard to find a place to shower, to use the restroom, to change in. And you kind of get a sense there's a lot of people who do that. But anyway, it was difficult. It was difficult sometimes. It wasn't as romantic as it sounded, but it definitely made me pretty, I guess, tough, because there was times where I was thinking, this is ridiculous. What am I doing? Get back to work like everybody else is.
So there's a long tradition in literature, in religion, and spiritual traditions generally, of basically taking a trip or a journey, or there's also different ways. I think there's people call it what do they call it? A spirit walk or something. Basically the idea is you go away for instance, Jesus goes away for 40 days, I think, in the wilderness. That would be one very prominent example. So, when I think about those times, because you and I spent a lot of time together in college, a lot of time, and we had a lot of fun, and we became very close. And then all of a sudden you're gone and you're just traveling the country. And so from my perspective, again, it always seemed like it seemed like you were searching for something. It seemed like you were looking for something. So during this time, this 9 months when you're traveling the country and sleeping in parks, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you doing? Like, what's going through your mind?
Yeah, I think that you hit it, Brian. I think you hit a couple points there. It's kind of the man in the cave story from Plato, right? So the guy that leaves the one prisoner who breaks free of his shackles, he breaks free, and the images that he saw his whole life were just shadows.
Shadows on the cave. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, he thought that was reality. He gets away, he breaks through, and he walks by, and he sees kind of the puppeteers on the ground, and then he goes out and he sees the sun, and that's reality. So I think that's kind of going back to what you were saying, which is today. Let's face it, it's the Bilbo Baggins, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's those kind of going out. And some people are kind of called to go out, some people are pulled out. I was definitely pulled out of that, and I think it was, I could say these things like to find yourself, but I think it was to get away from just everything and see what was I made of. Because let's face it, when you're around people your whole life, you're sometimes living in what they expect you to be. And I mean, we still do that today, whether it's your spouse, and some of that's good, right? I mean, some of those are norms that we have to have just to live together. But I wanted to get away and be on my own and say, what is Toby really like?
Yeah. And that's interesting you say that, because I've considered, and I'll eventually do this. I don't know if you've ever heard of these intensive 10-day meditation retreats where there's no drinking. It's all vegetarian food. You wake up at 4 a.m. You meditate basically for 15 hours a day. There's no communication, not even looking at people. Communicating. And you do that for 10 days. And I've read stories about this. I mean, it's basically complete and total isolation for 10 days with nothing but your mind. And
Yeah.
I've read stories about how, the first 3 or 4 days of this are horrible. They're terrible because people just aren't comfortable with their own thought process. But after a while, people say that by the time they're done with this, they just have this sense of clarity and this sense of ease. And, especially nowadays, Toby, when we're just constantly bombarded by incoming information from screens,
Mm-hmm.
it's like we never have a time to just sit back and contemplate life and our place in the universe and things like that. So did you use that opportunity to kind of maybe get some clarity on what you wanted to do? Or was it more like
Yeah.
I just don't know what I want to do right now, so I'm going to go travel the country?
Yeah, it's funny. I think it was all of those, Brian. We could do a whole probably 5 podcasts on, kind of the what you learn from being on your own and kind of going through. I remember having those moments. You said the first 4 days. I remember the first day or 2 days leaving all my stuff in storage, going, this is crazy. This is crazy. This is crazy. After the adrenaline rush goes of I'm breaking free from the corporate America. I remember thinking, this is a terrible idea. What have I done? I've given up everything. But I mean, to answer your question simply, certainly to find myself, like, who am I? What do I want to do? And, at that age, what you do for a living is very important, right? I mean, that's less important, I think, now in our lives. It's still important. But I think at that age, I was really trying to think, what am I? Like, what am I going to do for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
And so, I stumbled across some ideas. In fact, in the spiritual life, I really thought hard about a vocation to the priesthood. And I really pursued that, ended up finding that was not the path for me. And so that was great. There were some great learning points in that. But going back to what you're saying, finding space where there's no noise is so difficult today. It's not fashionable to do that. We don't actually want to do that, right? We choose not to do that. If you have a moment, what are you doing? You're not closing your eyes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I started meditating a little less than 10 years ago, and there's a famous saying, I forget right now who said it, but they said the most problems with the human race can be traced to the inability of man to sit in a room by himself for 10 minutes, right? And when I first started meditating, I meditated, and I've written about this publicly, I meditated because I was having a lot of anxiety. I was having panic attacks. And I remember, just like you're saying, the first time I sat down for 5 minutes, it seemed like an eternity. I could not believe how long it lasted. But once you start meditating for a while, you get a little bit of distance between your thoughts, a little bit of clarity, but it is hard, especially nowadays. Meditation is not something that just happens. I mean, you have to make an effort to do it. And especially nowadays, I think it's really, really important to do. So you're on your journey, and you're 9 months into this journey, and you're in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, right.
And like Forrest, like you said, you just stopped running.
Stop running.
What was it that caused you to stop running?
It's fun. I'd say it's kind of like being on a long bike ride or run. You don't know what it was, but your soul is done.
Yeah.
Like, for you, somebody else could have gone longer or shorter, but for you, it was done. And I think and I'd love to say that all my questions were answered. I got it. I know who I am now.
Eureka!
I'm going to do this, and this for the rest of my life. But, I'd say that, I took a big risk doing that, right? Because nobody was doing that. In fact, a lot of people said this is a terrible idea. And I remember asking my mother, Mom, what do you think I should do? This is what I want to do. And mother, who's usually very cautious with her baby son out of 4 of us, she said, you might be able to do this when you're older, but you won't want to.
Yeah.
And I think that was good advice, meaning I might have time later, but you just might not have the drive to do it. So to answer your question simply, there isn't anything I can point to why I stopped, but I think I guess if I could say it, in my mind and soul, is I got what I needed.
Yeah. Well, shout out to Kathy, your mom, one of my favorite people in the world. How's she doing, by the way?
She's doing great. She thinks highly of you. That's one reason why we moved back to San Antonio.
Hey, Kathy, if you're listening, I miss you, man. You used to send me emails. Send me some more emails.
Oh, be careful what you ask for, my friend.
Once a week. Just send me once a week. No chain email.
She's doing great. She's she's really showed her spirit. She marched with Martin Luther King when she was younger.
Did she really?
Yeah, and she actually worked for the FBI at the time, and she told me that they even told her, you might not want to be doing this. Again, I don't think there was anything, covert about it. It was just bad PR. And so she's really been interested in, been talking a lot about what's going on today, which is probably a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, maybe I'll get her on the podcast. I'd love to see her. And not to get on a sidetrack here, but your mom, in many ways, at least in my perspective, is a little bit like my dad, because like my dad had a tragic event happen when my brother and I were very young, and he basically had to raise us as a single father. And your mom, as I recall, her something happened to her first husband.
Yeah,
too.
Her first husband, Aggie, got killed by a drunk driver. He worked for the Texas Highway Department.
Yeah, and he was on the job when it happened, so it was
on the job.
out of nowhere. And that was not your biological?
No, that was my oldest brother, Michael, and Melissa's father. So they were, I think, 4 and 3, or 4 and 2, I think.
Yeah. And so your mom is always, I've always been, your mom's always motivated me a lot, just because I know that she went through some, some tough times, some really tough times.
Yeah.
But man, when you look at the kids she raised and how you guys turned out, it's just kind of remarkable. So seriously, tell her I said hi.
I will. She'll be happy to hear that, Brian.
Yeah. So you stopped running, and 9/11 has not happened at this point.
Correct. Yeah, it's not happened. Yeah, this is a bit, I think, 2000. Yeah.
And so what do you do next?
So 2000, come back to, so 9/11 has not come back, or hasn't happened yet. And so I go back to Dallas, and which is, probably my least favorite city. Sorry, Dallas.
That's okay.
And went to work for my old boss, and we were there starting an office. It was kind of a startup. We were starting a new office for a firm that's based out of Arizona.
What business were you in?
So it was in construction business, so commercial construction, so high rises, hospitals, big stuff. And I went to work for Bryce Hill. You remember Lance Hill, probably, yeah. Brian, his father.
Sure.
Really, probably one of the, he was a prominent business construction guy in Texas. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
And I went to work for him. He was a good man. And then 9/11 happened.
And so what happens to Toby Flinn when 9/11 happens?
So, at this time I was still discerning what I'm going to do with my life. I was looking at grad school, was looking at law school, a lot of those things people go through still. So although I had taken my trip.
Not married, no kids.
No kids. So yeah, that's an interesting point. I'd kind of decided that I'm not even going to date anybody. I'm going to be kind of a monk, if you will. There was just so much that I needed to kind of learn and find. I wasn't wrestling through emotional issues or any hang-ups. It was just, there was so much out there in the world, Brian, that I needed to know. I wanted to know it. And I didn't want anybody slowing me down, or better said, I didn't want to be distracted.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I'll never forget, was listening to the radio when the airplane hit the towers in Dallas, downtown Dallas. And, I went home that night, and my sister's birthday is on September 11th. And so we talked, and, she was obviously upset about it. I remember going to the Catholic church close to where I lived, and I went to pray. And, I'd certainly ask God, what do you want me to do? Here I am. What do you want me to do? And I've asked you a lot. Just tell me, I'm tired. I'm tired of playing this game. Probably angry, Brian. I mean, probably angry. Like, things are going on. I need some direction. And, you always want something to come down like a lightning bolt. Well, very rarely does that happen to anybody. But, for whatever reason, I decided I'm going to join the Marine Corps. I'm going to do one tour. And if the Marine Corps won't take me, then I'm not going. For some reason, I had that in my mind.
Yeah. So walk us through that process. You're working, you got a good job, and now all of a sudden you're going to make a massive change.
Yeah.
And like I was talking to with Blake, getting in the Marine Corps after 9/11 is basically a virtual guarantee that you're going to combat, right?
Yeah.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, that, like there's almost no doubt about it at this point. Like I'll just ask you, like when you joined the Marines, was your expectation that you would end up in combat?
Yes, it was my expectation. I would have been, and some were. I would have been sorely disappointed if I had not.
Yeah. And this is something that for people that have not served in the military, some people, I think it's hard for us to appreciate that feeling. Like most people do not want to run into a combat zone. Like that's the last thing they want to do. And especially when they're comfortable in the United States and
Yeah.
they're a little bit older and they don't have to do it because there are younger kids that are already doing it for us. So
Yeah.
what was it about? I mean, because it just sounds a little bit, frankly, nuts to
Yeah.
want to go and fight people. So where did that come from?
I think you could trace this back. I've never done this on paper, but I think you could trace it back to when I kind of traveled around the United States, Brian. I broke free, right? So I left the domesticity, right? So I hadn't read Plato's The Cave at that time. I think I'd heard of it. I kind of heard the story of Epic of Gilgamesh and that kind of Luke Skywalker. We all understand the archetype hero, which is that's who you've been talking to, right, on your podcast, Brian. The archetype heroes who've kind of gone out. And so I think that trip away kind of, it allowed me to say, this isn't that crazy. Like this is going out into the wilderness again. But now instead of being, kind of slowly being pulled out to go see the United States and travel, I felt like I was being called.
Yeah. So what is it like? So Blake said, I found the Marine Corps station that had a slot, so I could virtually guarantee if I could get through, I would get some sort of commission of some sort. So walk us through. I mean, is it officer candidate school first?
It is. Well, you and I were in the Corps Cadets, and I, joining the military was probably out of 100, pretty close to 100 when I got out of the Corps Cadets.
Yeah.
Don't come from a family of military, so even the Corps Cadets was pretty foreign to me. And so it wasn't on my list, and so I didn't even know where to go. But I did find the OSO, so basically an officer who kind of selects officers in the city, and you sign some paperwork, and they give you a physical fitness test, and before you know it, then you have to take some tests and drug tests and all of that stuff, and then before you know it, you get a letter that says you've been accepted, and then you go, oh my goodness, I actually did this,
Yeah. So
it's pretty quick.
Yeah.
It's a blur, to be honest with you.
Are we talking a couple weeks, a month, 2 months, or just like you just look up and all of a sudden you're in basic training? So
9/11 happened, right? So I was in the first OCS class post 9/11. So the very first OCS class after 9/11, I was in, and that was January 18th. So from September to January 18th. On January 18th, I was in Quantico, Virginia, with somebody yelling at me, getting my trunk full of Q-tips and white underwear and throwing them all over the parade deck. So, do the math. It's a very short fuse.
Yeah, very short, very short. So first class of OCS, I imagine that class probably had a mix of people that did it kind of what I would consider the traditional way, where they graduate from college and they're in an ROTC program and then they go immediately into the military. But I'll bet you there were some guys in your class who were like you that got in for basically the same reasons that you did. So what was that like?
There were. I'll start off quickly with me arriving into Quantico, and there was snow on the ground. And I remember looking at how beautiful Virginia is, the rolling hills, the landscapes. And I tell you what, this is a common phrase in Quantico. When you drive in, you see landscape. To Quantico, when you leave, you see terrain.
I love that. That's cool, man.
And I remember seeing snow on the ground, and I remember thinking, this might not have been a good idea. Again, similar to the trip around the United States and Canada. this might not been a good idea. And if you don't think that, then you're probably not taking the risk that you need to take. And I think you could agree with that, being a successful business owner. If you're not questioning yourself, is this crazy? Then you're probably playing it too safe. Yes, to answer your question, it was probably half and half. And that was probably one of my biggest fears, that I was going to have some of the guys that we went to school with and gals who were hard chargers, who understood the military, who, really were tight with the military culture. And I was not in that culture. And so I was a little nervous of that. I was nervous. I was in a different place in my life. And so I was curious to see how I was going to handle that.
It's interesting that, you talk about being afraid and being nervous. And I think some people maybe have an impression that, especially Marines, don't have fear. And as far as I can tell, not only is it, to me, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is having fear and going through with it anyway, right?
Yeah, right.
And people that don't have a little bit of fear about, for example, joining the Marine Corps right after 9/11, probably have a screw loose in some capacity, right? I mean, so
True.
So the point is you have these fears, but you do it anyway, and you just kind of force yourself to do it. So was it officer candidate school first or the basic?
Yeah, correct. It was officer candidate school, so that's 10 weeks. So okay. 10 weeks in the winter in Virginia, and you and I are from Texas. We're not really used to the cold,
right?
The cold.
Yeah, I'm getting cold just
especially when you're
out about it.
Yeah, I remember breaking ice, and I'm not trying to make this sound glamorous or more tough than it was, but I remember breaking ice with my M16 to get through. You're going through a pond about this high, and breaking your M16. And if you're from Texas, you're thinking, "There's no way I'm gonna, I'm not cut out for this."
Yeah, I'm definitely not cut. I don't like the cold, so I'm not sure.
That's why you're wearing a vest right now, and
exactly.
It's 100 degrees outside.
Exactly. Although I will tell you this, I started jumping in my pool every morning because my pool is cold and I hate it. And I figure if I just do some things that I don't like to do, maybe I would make myself a little bit tougher. And now I've gotten to the point where I really look forward to it, actually.
Isn't that an amazing concept? Why do we, and I exercise in the morning for the same reason. I start off doing something that I don't want to do. And why does it make me better? I don't understand. That's a whole other podcast.
That's a whole nother podcast, but it is interesting how quickly you can. So I decided at the beginning of this year that I had, for the past couple of years, I had kind of been lazy. Like I hadn't been pushing myself. My business was going well, kids are going well, stuff like that, but I wasn't challenging myself in the way I needed to. And I felt like I was getting a little soft, frankly. So I started jumping in a cold pool. I took up Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I did a few other things to push myself. And it's funny because, most of the time you don't want to get up and do those things. They're hard. They're challenging. You can get hurt. But when you do them, man, you feel so much better than you do if you just sit around and try to do things that make you feel good all the time, right?
That's an interesting concept, isn't it?
Yeah.
We should talk more about that later.
Yeah, for sure. So you get through officer candidate school, and then after that you go to the basic school?
Go to the basic class. So you roll right into the basic school. So basically, essentially it's the TBS is 6 months, and that's a little less boot campish. I say boot campish because officer candidate school is not boot camp. It's the officer candidate school. It's has a different feel to it. I've never went to boot camp, but my friends who did can tell you that boot camp is more psychological. OCS is more physical. Try to crush you that way. I will say this though, it's funny. I did learn some tricks from the Corps cadets. It was about in OCS. It was probably like week 7, and there was a guy that was 2 bunks down from me because you sleep in a big squad bay. And he said, "Toby," he goes, "I didn't even know you were in my platoon until week 7." He goes, "How did you do that?" And it's funny. I learned that don't draw attention to yourself in those environments. Just don't try to be the best. Don't try to be the worst. Just keep your mouth shut. And that was hard for me because, as you know, I stuttered growing up as a kid really bad. And so there was moments when you had to rattle off some things. And I'll never forget some of the drill instructors, they they are probably still laughing at candidate Flynn trying to say something and stuttering, and it just good, very, very good humor. But again, another thing that kind of teaches you to be humble.
Yeah, and my good friend, our good mutual friend Carl Baggett, he had a saying that's always stuck in my head. He says, "You got to block and tackle first. Like you got to block and tackle first." And so I think one thing you and I learned in the Corps, especially as freshmen, is you got to put your head down and you got to make your grades and you got to block and tackle.
Yeah,
And then afterwards you can, assume a leadership position,
yeah,
whatever it may be. So you get out of the basic school,
yeah,
an infantry officer at this point, right? You're a first.
No, so I was a logistics officer at that time, but joined a infantry battalion, and that's a whole funny story too. We can get to that shortly, but yeah, so a logistics officer, they sent me some training. It wasn't very long. It was probably another maybe 3 months. And then from there, straight to Camp Pendleton for about 2 weeks, and then straight to the deserts of Kuwait. And I mean, this is before anything was built up in Kuwait.
So as a logistics officer, are you in charge of a group of enlisted men, or how does it work? Logistics.
So when you're in an infantry battalion, the Marine Corps is infantry centric.
Yeah.
It is, as is the Army. And rightfully so. So if you're not infantry, you are a second class citizen, and they do eat their young.
Yeah.
And when you're a logistics officer in an infantry battalion, you actually have a significant job because nobody wants to do that stuff. But you have a platoon just like your infantry brethren, who I had 45 enlisted men in my platoon. And then some interesting things happened where I actually became a company commander in that infantry battalion, which probably broke some rules, but my battalion commander made it happen. And so there I was.
So what is a logistics? So I understand what an infantry officer does. You basically have an infantry platoon and you're in charge of these enlisted guys. And basically you are responsible for their well-being immediately. Yeah. And so how was it different, or was it different as a logistics officer?
Yeah, it is different. And again, I'm going to preface by saying my experience was very different because if you remember, as was everybody's, this was the Wild West. This was Operation Iraqi Freedom 1. This was literally invading a country. Nobody in that battalion had ever done anything like this before.
Yeah.
So my job was, initially it was to get the battalion across the border. So everything from movements and the order of movements to, where you get supplies. So the schedule for, how you get from point A to point B. And again, when we crossed the border, it was not a super organized, movement. It was going across the desert with, vehicles getting lost, and a whole other story there. But
let's back up.
Once hostilities slowed down, I was actually in charge of construction.
Let's back up just a little bit, because I want to hear about like what's going through your mind when you land in essentially a combat. So, like, are you looking forward to it? Are you nervous? Is it mixed emotions? Like, what are you thinking about because for certain at this point, when you're in Kuwait, you are going into combat, period.
Yeah. I honestly thought there's no way this is going to happen. Really? I mean, you're kind of thinking this is not really going to happen. But then it does happen. You start to see, I was one of the first ones on the ground as my battalion was on a ship coming over. The infantry battalion was, and so I was in the middle of the desert with about 15 people living in a tent, like in the middle of nowhere. Really? And so you kind of feel like I feel like I was back in the desert again, right? Here I am back on, alone. It's very quiet. It was just getting cold. It was probably late February. And so in my mind, I'm thinking this isn't going to happen. But then you start to see the buildup of troops coming, and then you still don't think it's going to happen. You're kind of in disbelief. I mean, you're preparing for it. So that when the battalion hits the ground, Brian, all we're doing is preparing. So everybody's cleaning weapons. There's very limited maneuvers you can do, training you can do. Might be fire your weapons into a sand pile to make sure that they work. I had a 9mm. I was an officer, so I would have better luck throwing that 9mm at somebody and hurting them than shooting them with it.
Yeah.
But that's the best you're going to do in that environment. And then I'll pause there, but we got the call to go across the border, and then it was real.
Then the you know what hit the fan, essentially, I would assume.
It was real. It was
So
real,
tell us
and it was
about.
very non-eventful initially. We crossed into the border. We passed some Bedouin tents, and here I am seeing old tanks from Gulf War. This is when you're starting to get a history lesson, right?
Right.
You're starting to go, I'm going into Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
I'm not going into Canada.
Yeah. Boy, what a way to put it, too. Mesopotamia, and people that are familiar with the history of that region will remember that after World War II, essentially they divided up Mesopotamia into Iraq, Iran, Syria. I think Syria was included, Afghanistan, maybe some of those other countries. But the point is, the borders of that region were artificial borders. Like, we don't, I think, appreciate as Americans that the culture in Mesopotamia is very tribal, and within the religion of Islam, there are three main sects, but there are two big sects, Sunni and Shia. And so you're traveling basically into the biblical country of Mesopotamia. And what do you, I mean, what's it like going through, you know, the probably one of the most historical places in human history? I mean, are you looking for people to engage or what? I mean, what are you doing?
Well, so the initial part of the invasion was, was very non-eventful, meaning crossing the actual line of departure, as we would call it, as the Iraqi-Kuwait border. But after we started going in through the city, our first city was Al-Naziriyah, and that was really messy. So the battalions were doing a picket fence. So 1st Marine Division, so one battalion would kind of go out on a road and peel off and, aim their weapons outboard and fire and cover while the other battalion kind of plows through. And so that was very, that's when you feel like you're in a movie.
Is this when when people are actually shooting back at you?
This is when people are shooting at you, and you have a soft skin Humvee, which makes me laugh now because now fast forward 9 years later, I'm in Afghanistan. I'm riding in like a monster truck that nobody could blow this thing up.
Yeah.
And so we're driving through Jeeps. Some of them don't even have doors, right? Yeah. I'll never forget. So an RPG, we're driving at night, and an RPG went right over the hood of our Humvee. And my Marine Lance Corporal, he freaked out. He couldn't handle all the commotion. So we had to switch drivers. I mean, just there's a lot of things where you really feel like you're in a movie because you don't have a context. The only time you've ever seen that has been in a movie, except in training, right?
Yeah.
But now it's for real.
What was it like the first time somebody fired at you in anger? What did that feel like? I mean, was it like you were nervous or you were scared, or was it like the training kicked in and you just kind of do what the training teaches you?
You do what you need to do. You don't, and that's when I think, you do what you need to do, and you're impressed by the number of people who do what they need to do. You don't see people, you see very few people going high into the right, meaning the people who have a couple, that aren't all together in their brain. You don't see that a lot, and you don't see many people kind of freeze, but you do see both.
So you go through this first city. What's the name of the city?
Al-Naziriyah.
Al-Naziriyah, and then do you take the city, or what happens after that?
No, we don't take the city. So General Mattis, at the time, the strategy was to push through. So get to Baghdad. Our mission was to do a feint in Al-Qut and kind of draw some of Saddam's forces down to us as the army kind of swung way to the west and took Baghdad. So 1st Marine Division's job initially was to be a feint to draw forces to thinking we were going to come up from the center-east. And again, we're traveling along roads, just like highways. And I would say for the most part, pretty good highways. Iraq, you can't swing a cat without hitting an engineer in Iraq. A lot of them, very smart people, industrious. So their infrastructure, was very good in a lot of places.
Yeah. And so you say you're basically a feint or a decoy, or
we're decoy.
So you're drawing forces away, and so kind of walk us through what happens during this time period.
Yeah, so and I'll kind of preface this by saying the first deployment to Iraq was very different than the second one. The first one had some hostilities up front. We went all the way into Baghdad. We encountered some enemy here and there. We lost our first Marine outside of Baghdad to a sniper. So after all of that, we lost our only Marine, well, not our only, but our first Marine outside of Baghdad to a sniper. We marched into Baghdad, which is where that picture behind you is taken. That's Sadr City.
So everybody watching on YouTube, I've got a picture in the background, and I've got Toby and
another Marine. Yeah,
who's with you there?
I can't remember his name, Brian.
Okay, so so this picture is, I think you told me before we started, this is in Baghdad.
It is, yeah. So that's overlooking Sadr City, which is in Baghdad.
So you eventually, your is it battalion? Your battalion?
Our battalion, yeah.
Eventually made it to Baghdad.
Yeah. So again, not very exciting. A lot of long days on the road with a couple skirmishes here and there. Problems with getting fuel, food. That's when General Mattis really made a name for himself of his strategy of getting to Baghdad, securing Baghdad, and then pushing back south to secure the areas. But so we got into Baghdad, and we had liberated a city. You felt like you were. I mean, I always use this phrase when I talk to my kids, but you do feel like you're in a movie. People are throwing roses at your tanks. So our battalion has tanks, amphibious assault vehicles, a lot of armor, and then they have guys like me and most of the infantry folks just in soft skin Humvees. And people are throwing roses at you as we go into Baghdad. It's like a parade.
That's unbelievable. So the overall reception of the civilian population it sounds like it was pretty positive for the most part.
It was, but you and I both know that there's some, when things happen and you don't know whether that's good or bad, but people were energetic, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah. And at this point, has Saddam been toppled?
No, not at all. He had not. We hadn't found him yet. We didn't know where he was.
How long did you end up staying in Baghdad?
We were in Baghdad for probably about 3 weeks, where that picture was taken from probably the 7th floor of a cigarette factory. Marines, we invade a cigarette factory and take it over. And if you didn't smoke when you got to that factory, you did when you left.
So this is were there any other big events that happened during your first deployment?
No, it was very different. The two deployments are very different. This one was very, I would say, relatively peaceful. I spent the rest of that 9 months. My battalion commander knew that I had an engineering background, and he put me in charge of rebuilding cities and kind of being a city engineer and city planner all over southern Iraq. And we were driving around in, Toyota trucks, Hiluxes.
Yeah, just like you saw on CNN, they had all these
just like in
insurgents.
CNN.
Yeah, these insurgents piled into these pickup trucks. Basically.
We were driving in those. It was not very dangerous at that time.
And then you come back to the United. How long was your first deployment? 9 months?
9 months. Okay. 9 months.
And you come back?
Come back and then train up 9 months, go right back for 9 months.
And was that something you volunteered for, or is that something the Marine Corps said you're going back?
Yeah. Yeah. So your first kind of tour in the fleet, right? So now I'm in the fleet. So, and that was also another choice I made when I was at TBS was I need to get in the fleet. I'm not going to go take a regimental staff job in Quantico or headquarters. I'm going to the fleet. In fact, the funny story is that's why I chose logistics. There's a couple reasons why I chose that. One was because I had a best shot of getting into the fleet fast and to war fast. And also my future wife was living in San Diego, and I could have a pretty good chance of moving to San Diego.
Nice.
But yeah, so the Marine Corps, once you get in the fleet, you're in it for 4 years. You're not shifting around.
Yeah. So you go back. How long are you in the United States before you have to go back for another tour?
9 months,
okay.
If that. And so 9 months is very busy.
How was this? So you went back to Iraq for your second tour?
Back to Iraq.
And how was the second tour different from the first tour?
Very different. Things had changed. The Muqtada al-Sadr, funny enough, where that picture is taken, Sadr City, his son is Muqtada al-Sadr. And he had developed and kind of grown into a pretty prominent figure in the Shiite population. Sistani was kind of the the lead religious leader, and we ended up being in Najaf, which is kind of like the Rome or the Vatican for the Shiite Muslims. So there was a lot was going on. We had things going on in Fallujah. We had things going on in Najaf. That's when IEDs really were coming about. So the enemy had, all the energy was gone. There was a big vacuum, obviously. And, that's a whole other discussion on politics and strategy. But this deployment was almost all combat. It was all kinetic. Everything was serious. You weren't drinking tea and coffee in the local shop talking about where somebody was from. You were fighting.
Blake described the combat that he experienced as basically like street to street combat for the most part. He said it was not necessarily like you would see in like a World War II movie. He said a lot of the fights that he was fighting when he was there were close quarter, literally street to street,
Yeah.
like urban combat essentially. Was that kind of what you were experiencing?
Absolutely. So we had we were in Najaf. There was two major battles at this time. There was one in Najaf and Fallujah. Najaf came first and was kind of the blueprint for Fallujah in some ways. Najaf was different though. Najaf, again, it was the Vatican of Shiite Muslims, so very protected religious site. And the folks we were going against, Muqtada al-Sadr and his militia, they had kind of taken over a cemetery, which is full of catacombs. So think like New Orleans catacombs, where there's places to go down below. And so the fighting happened in the city and in the catacombs. So very, very different than
That's got to
open.
be so intense.
It was intense. I mean, it's, when you make a mistake there, it's somebody's life. I mean, I'll give you an example, and this is Sergeant Moses Rocha. Great guy. He was my machine gunner. We were driving into the cemetery. We were pulled off on the side of the road, and I took one step out of my Humvee, and I heard somebody yell. And he was right behind me. Got shot straight through the heart. Dead, gone, forever.
It's just your machine gunner just gone.
Gone. Yeah. And I was standing right next to him. There's about 3 people in the vehicle. And, that's how, I decided to stop at some point. Why? I think it was because it looked like it was good cover. But the fighting was over to my right, but the shot came from a building up on to my left.
Yeah. Man, it's hard to even imagine what that must have been like. I mean, so, I'm picturing in my mind, somebody gets shot through the heart. I'm running for cover. Like I don't know what I would do in that situation. So what do you guys do in that situation? Is it like, again, you're just training, you're
trained. And if there's anything the Marine Corps does, and I spent time in the Army too, is the Marine Corps trains their young officers and NCOs the best in the world. They are trained for this. So, when I saw that, maybe 2 years before, I would have done the same thing, Brian. I wouldn't have known what to do, but my instincts knew what to do. And
Blake said, and this is something that'll stick with me for a very long time, about what you're talking about in the training. He said, we were talking about how sometimes officers are more of a target for the enemy. And he said he never really felt in peril that much because he was working with the most competent people in the world. Like that's the way he described his fellow Marines. So how long were you in this very intense kind of urban combat?
I think it was roughly 3 weeks. There was kind of a courting process going up to it of getting approval to go in to bomb certain areas. So, my battalion commander actually lives in Fredericksburg, not far from here, and him and I have become close and kind of rekindled our relationship. He was with us on both deployments. So it was about 3 weeks, I think, working with the battalion, strategizing, and then we obviously got support, and that's where I got to see the Army come in. The Army came in, and if you're a Marine, you usually don't have very good respect for the Army, but the Army came in, and they were absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. And then I think you might be talking to Nick Halt. Nick Halt's going to have a very different experience. Him and I spent a lot of time in Najaf together, and then I stayed in Najaf, and then he got called to go up to Fallujah. Yeah. So that's where you talk about someone who's going to talk about some stories of house to house.
Yeah.
Nick's going to have some stories.
Yeah. So how long were you in Iraq total for your second deployment?
It was 9 months, Brian.
Another 9 months. Okay. So you come back to the United States and you're back in the United States. How long are you back in the United States after your second one?
The second one?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I ended up getting out of the Marine Corps at that one. So I think I was back in the battalion for another 9 months, and guess they were going right back.
Yeah. And you decided at that point you had done what you needed to do, and you were you were going to get out of the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
You mentioned
I got married at the time.
Time in the Army, so you got to talk about that a little bit. So, you do 2 combat tours.
We're gonna run out of time.
Marine officer, and then you're in the Army. How does that work?
So I got out of the Marine Corps. I did one tour, like I said I was going to do. Married Melanie. We started our family. We're living in Austin. Kind of just slowly easing into life. Trying to be normal again, I guess is the right way to say it. And it's different when you come out of the Marine Corps. And again, you think about when you come out of the Marine Corps at that time, or the Army or the military, everybody just thinks so highly of you. And contrast that to the Vietnam veterans who, when they came back, they didn't even tell people that they had gone.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of dealing with a lot of things. You're dealing with honors. You're dealing with ribbons that you got, and you're kind of learning about, honor is not something you kind of say you want to be. It's pinned on you, and someone says this is what right looks like, and so you're pinned on that, right or wrong, and now you've got something that you kind of have to live up to, and so you're still struggling with all of these things as you get back to the civilian life.
Yeah.
And Marine Corps, I get a letter in the mail that says the Marine Corps wants you back. So was involuntarily recalled back into the Marine Corps.
Really? And so did you have to go back into combat?
So they gave us a choice. They said you can either wait for a letter that comes in the mail, and we don't know, you don't know where they're going to send you. Could be anywhere. Could be headquarters Quantico, or you can find a unit. So I found a unit, and they said, well, we're going to send you to Hawaii. And so we ended up moving to Hawaii for 2 years.
And then there was a point in your military career where I think you got some language training, right?
I did, yeah. So that was in the Army side. I took, everyone learns a little bit of Arabic, at least like you do Spanglish in San Antonio or Texas. You know how to say a few things.
Yeah, sí, senor.
See, but I did. So the Corps of Engineers recruited me from Hawaii. I don't know how they did it, but they did. And I was in charge of a kind of a special forces for nerds team. So it was an engineering team, and we went all over the world doing engineering projects, construction projects, but language training was part of that. So I did about a total of 7 months of Farsi training.
You still speak Farsi?
I do.
Say something in Farsi.
میتونم داری صحبت کنم اما تلفظ من بسیار ضعیف است.
Okay, what did you just say?
I said I can speak Dari or Farsi, but my accent is very terrible.
Yeah, I did notice the accent was kind of weird. No, I'm just kidding about that. So did you spend some time in Iraq when you were in the Army?
No, went straight to Afghanistan.
Okay, you went to Afghanistan. All right, yeah. So you're one of the I want to say few people, but I'm sure there's a good number of people that spent time in Iraq.
Yeah.
And Afghanistan. How long were you in Afghanistan?
9 months. Same.
What was that like compared to Iraq?
Very different. It was also a different time in Afghanistan. I would say it was relatively peaceful. Afghanistan's a very different country though. I mean, culture different, it's not an Arab culture. So you're kind of relearning some of the things and customs, but it's a very rural country, and so yeah. Where Iraq's very modernized in a lot of ways, very educated. Iraq is. Afghanistan's different, and if you talk about differences between Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq, Afghanistan has a long history of, if they're not fighting an enemy, they're fighting each other, and it's all terrain based.
Yeah. Was that, so you're 9 months in the Army now? This is your essentially your third tour of duty. Yeah. And Did you do any more deployments after that, or was the third one your last?
That was the last one. Yeah, that was the last one. So besides a bunch of trips to Korea and other places, that was the last full deployment to a combat zone.
And then you come back to the United States, and this time, do they let you out permanently?
Uh, so no, they don't. I owed some time for a couple master's degrees in language training. So they have a great 2-for-1 deal. For every 1 year of school you owe me 2 years.
Yeah.
They're not stupid. They
No,
really got
no,
it down. They got it down. They got it
they're
down
not.
pat.
They're
Yeah.
not stupid.
It'll go by really quick, Toby. It'll go by really quick, Toby. Just sign right here.
Yeah, no worries. You
Yeah,
don't need to
no
read it.
worries.
So you get out of the. So you're in the Marines, and then you're in the Army. What?
On the Army, yeah, and that was I mean, we could talk the whole story about how to become an Army guy after the Marine Corps, because it's kind of like anything. You're where you spent your formative years. That's who you are. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And although I brought a lot to it, I still, like, I was talking to a colonel, I think yesterday, and I kept saying the word regiment. And in the Army they use brigade, and
Yeah.
but everybody knows that I was a Marine, so they kind of just laugh.
So Toby, you retired what was your final rank when you retired?
So I'm a lieutenant colonel, but I'm still in. They still got me for about another year.
Do they really? Okay.
In the reserves.
Okay. And you've now got a family, and you've been married for a while. So is it safe to say, and please say yes to this, that it's very unlikely that you're going to have to go back to combat at this point?
I guess I could choose to say no right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. So after you got out of the military, what have you been doing since then?
So the Army put me on a trajectory of being, like, really focusing on engineering, Brian. So I think that, as we all take our paths in life, at some point you think, well, what's your profession?
Yeah.
And I had spent time doing construction. The military taught me all kinds of things in the political, diplomatic world. But really, at my heart of hearts, I'm a builder and engineer. So, I went straight back into engineering, kind of really focused, and said, it's time to make up some time. And that's what's interesting, when you come out of the military, you're kind of starting over.
Yeah.
You might be lucky and get some great job if you want to become sort of, strategic planner or something like that. But that wasn't on my path. So in some ways, you kind of have to start over.
And now, like a lot of officers in the military, you're starting your own business.
I am. Yeah.
So I know you're kind of early in the process. Are you free to talk about?
I am. Yeah, I am. I've had a lot of support from my current employer, who's one of the largest engineering firms in the nation. So yeah, it's interesting. It's been good. I decided I was going to do this, and when I was in Iraq the first time, by the way, I said, I'm going to start a business when I make it out of this alive. But it took this long to figure out what that was going to be.
And so what is it? What are you doing?
So it's an engineering firm that focuses on doing construction work in very remote and austere locations. So State Department is a target market. Even the National Park Service are target market. So
what's the name of your company?
What's that?
What's the name of your company?
The company's Tobin Engineers.
Awesome. Well, if anybody's listening and they need a really bad-ass engineer, you got one on this podcast right now. So, well, that's great, Toby. So, we've been talking for quite a bit, and you and I were texting each other a couple of weeks ago about some of the things we wanted to talk about. So I want to shift here a little bit, if it's okay with you, and talk a little bit about, right now we're going through some of the most difficult times as a country that we have maybe ever gone through. I think that's safe to say. We've got this pandemic. There's so much uncertainty around it. We've got protests. We've got all this political mess where everybody's fighting each other, and it's just things are just a little chaotic. Right? Actually, they're a lot chaotic right now. Mm-hmm. And so one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the podcast, not just to hear a little bit about your military experience with us, which is awesome, but I also wanted to hear a little bit about some of your thoughts about dealing with anxiety, dealing with uncertainty, how people can be a little bit happier during these times. So as somebody who has been in combat multiple times, somebody that's seen close friends killed, like you talked about, what are your thoughts right now about what we're going through?
Yeah, it's interesting, and certainly my opinion is not what the truth is, right? But I think it is. So open for disagreement. You know, I would say that here today we've got it really good in the United States, and so when you start throwing a wrench in our life here in any Western society, whether the Amazon doesn't come in 24 hours, we really start to freak out. So we freak out over little things, and so why do we do that? I think is the question. Like, why have life becomes easy? We should be able to be pursuing higher things, like the contemplative life for truth. Or so when you don't have to dig a ditch every day, that should open up your mind to do higher things of a higher order. However, I don't know if we've been doing that, and I think that where it surfaces is that when we have something serious happen that challenges us and challenges what we think is important, we don't really. It's hard for us to react.
Yeah. It's almost like we've had it so good for so long that we've forgotten about what it's like to come together to truly come together as a country to tackle problems that actually affect all of us. And
Yeah,
so yeah, I worry a little bit, Toby, that like you said, I think the way you put it is very good. I worry a little bit that we've kind of lost our edge, or maybe we've gotten a little soft, or whatever you want to say. We've just forgotten what it was like. For instance, our grandparents, they went through the Depression,
yeah,
and some of them even might have went through the Spanish flu epidemic. Of
yeah,
course, our parents, my dad was in Vietnam, and my grandfather was in World War II, and the sacrifices that those generations made, continue to impress us. And we're getting tested right now as a country, and right now, at least, I'm optimistic about the future, but right now, I'm not sure we're meeting the test. So, what kind of having gone through some of the most traumatic experiences, some of the most intense experiences anybody could go through, what kind of advice would you have for people that are worried about either the pandemic, what's going to happen with that? They're worried about their jobs, they're worried about the protests, or if you're a black male, you're worried about the police, or if you're a police officer, you're worried about everything they're saying about police officers now. I mean, what would you tell people about how to deal with these really, really challenging issues that we're going through?
yeah. I mean, you've touched on a lot of topics there, and you know, it's difficult to articulate each one of those areas. But Dave, one of the things that Melanie and I do when we encounter some sort of stumbling block, it's taking things day by day. Okay, that's practical advice.
Yeah.
But I think there's a higher way of thinking about these things, and for me, it's a spiritual side. I mean, I do believe that there is a higher order. I do believe in a God, and if I believe in God, then I put philosophy kind of at a higher spot than I say science. And so, how does that relate to your question, Brian? I think it does, because when you're more focused on, I guess, a higher order of things, right? Like, what makes me happy?
Yeah.
Is it pleasure, honor, wealth, power? What do those things make me happy? Well, you and I have both hopped around those altars our whole life. We've found ourselves seeking those things, and what do we do when we get there? Well, it usually doesn't do a whole lot for us, right? I mean, you run a very successful business. Does that mean you're immune to anxiety? No, it doesn't. So I think it starts there, Brian. I think there's some practical advice that we could give, and that's great, but we really have to kind of rethink what's important in our life. And once we get that close to right, things start falling into place, and losing your job is still stressful. It doesn't mean it doesn't freak you out, but it's in its proper place.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, a good friend of mine, Ben Glass, he was actually the first guest on my podcast, and he taught me many years ago something that I had never thought about. And it was, you need to design your life before you design your business or everything else. Like, you need to ask yourself philosophically, what's important to you. So for instance, as as a lawyer, there are certain expectations that you'll work a certain amount of hours and you'll do this, and there's a certain path you have, and you'll sacrifice, frankly, time with your family, time with your kids, and that's just expected. And Ben taught me that it didn't have to be that way. And so, 15 years ago, I decided that my kids were going to come first, period. The family would come first. And so now the nice thing about that is if I get invited to go do something business-wise or something like that, and one of my kids has a sporting event, it's a really easy decision. The answer is no. The priority is the kids. But that's not because I have to make that decision every single time it comes up. It's because philosophically I've decided that that's the most important thing to me. And so now all the decisions that relate to that become a lot easier.
Have you found that, has that brought some peace in your life, Brian?
It has, because I don't have to stress about, am I going to go to this business function or am I going to go to this girls softball game? So I've kind of eliminated some of those decisions. Now, of course, there are times in your life for sure, and times in my life where we're going to miss things that our kids are doing because we have obligations. But I guess my point is, if there's a choice, like if there's a legitimate choice about doing something with my kids or doing something business-wise, it's going to be the kids every single time. And that, like you said, that's a philosophical.
It is.
That's kind of a way of looking at the world. So, I have a philosophy degree from A&M. I've always been very, very interested in philosophy, very interested, particularly as it relates to spirituality and ethics and religion and things like that. So I got to hear from you. And I know we've been going for a little. Do you have a few more minutes?
I've got all night, Brian.
Okay, good.
We can edit out all the Marine stuff.
Yeah, no, that's definitely staying. So tell us, like, from a philosophical standpoint, like, what are some of the rules or some of the ideas that you use to kind of govern what you do?
I think so. First and foremost, for me, I really have to look at life in a couple ways. And it gets very confusing now, but I think that we're using the word philosophy a lot, and philosophy is where theology is born out of, right? So that is the world of art, right? So art in my world is a higher order than let's say science or metrics, which is really just data.
Yeah.
But today we're kind of focused on data and science. If I can't see it and touch it, then it's probably not real. So that was probably one of the first things that I had to challenge a long time ago, is like, which way do I think? Do I believe in things I can't see and can't smell, but I feel like I'm drawn to? God is the center of my life. And because I submit to that, I'm already at a place where I feel like somebody's watching me. So somebody who is all good, all knowing, is watching me. And my job is to not let him down, is to make him smile. Now that sounds simple, right? But that's kind of how I live my life. Like if I'm not making him smile, then I'm not doing something right. And there's times when I make mistakes. Of course, we all do. We're all born that way. But if I'm not making him smile, Brian, then I need to rethink what I'm doing.
Yeah. And so there was so I go to a Methodist church, and the pastor before our current pastor said something that, everybody hears these quotes throughout their life, and it's amazing how some of them just stick with you for your entire life. And so he said something years ago that really stuck with me. And he said, if you come to church and walk out with a giant frown on your face, you're not getting the message. Like, the message is not to be afraid of God and to be afraid of what's going to happen. The message is more about a positive message. Like the way that the Methodist preacher that I was listening to put it is, if you're not happy about the word of God and the message, you're not getting the real message. I mean, you should walk out of church pretty much every time with a big smile on your face if you're really getting the message.
Yeah.
And so,
that's a good point.
Yeah. And so the way you put that, like, again, we're talking about kind of philosophical ways of looking at the world. If your way of looking at the world is, I'm going to behave in such a way that I'm going to try to make God smile, that makes decisions a lot easier, I would think.
It does. And, to kind of talk more, I guess, technically about it is, do you look at the world as a finite, or do you think there's an infinite side of it? So if you're always talking about my job, engineering, I deal with the finite world all day long. So
Yeah.
I deal with data, I deal with numbers.
Yeah.
That's all finite stuff. It's great. It's wonderful. It puts food on my table. But the infinite is what I'm more interested in. And if you're focused on this world, right, and this goes into religion, if this is it, right, if this is all we got, you and me, if this is, if I have to perform at the highest level, or things are going to fail, then yeah, I'm going to freak out if my son doesn't get into the school he's supposed to get into. Like, I'm gonna get anxious about that. But if there is a higher order, and this is important but not the most important, then I need to put it in its proper place.
Yeah. And that's a great way to put that. And I think, like a lot of parents, we tend to feel anxiety about some of the things our kids are going through. Like, I remember calling a friend of mine like 2 or 3 months ago, and I said, I called him up and I said, man, being a parent sucks. This is terrible. Like, I'm just anxious all the time about this and that.
Yeah.
But so what I found is exactly what you're talking about. If you have a little bit broader perspective on things, if you look a little bit past the immediate present and realize that getting into this school or making this sports team or being on the cheerleading squad and stuff like that is just a very, very, very tiny piece of life in general. It relaxes you a little bit. Like, you don't so stressed about things. So how much of your perspective on this stuff do you think was shaped by your experience in the military, and in particular your experience in combat, seeing people die, things like that? Or is this something that kind of shaped the way you look at the world?
I think so. I mean, if I think back about my personality beforehand, I was always curious and pretty level-headed on some cases. But I think I would fall into the trap, just like a lot of people, of although I said I believed in a God, I really didn't trust in that. I did that because I was supposed to, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think I really came back to that feeling I actually went on a quest to prove that God did not exist, I think, privately. And that's when I came to the realization that he did. But, I think so, Brian. I'm very comfortable in a chaotic environment. And so I know, because at that moment you have to think, if this is it, if I'm going to die on some desert, like if this is really it, then why would I be here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'm not doing it for the ribbons. And
what's the point?
What's the point? Like, I'm not here just to kind of be a tough guy. So I'm doing it for service. And what is service? Well, service is something higher than you. It's a higher order. It all goes back to that higher order and the correct order unit thing. So I think it definitely did, because even, I look back on how I was before I went into the service and did the things that I did. And I think I would fall into the same traps.
So it's interesting. The reason I ask you that question, Toby, is because, I had something that I didn't realize until recently really shaped my character. And that was my mother dying when I was 10. And that is the kind of thing that, if you just look at the science, having a parent die when you're young is considered to be one of the most traumatic things that you can go through. And so I think that it kind of made me realize that life is short. And, I remember, for instance, my 35th birthday was my worst birthday I've ever had, because that's how old my mom was when she died. And I just remember thinking how bizarre it is that I just outlived my own mother. But it gives you a perspective, just like war or other traumatic experiences. They give you maybe a little bit different perspective than you might otherwise have. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what she went through at a very young age, I think there's something to say about, when I hear stories about what happens to children when they're younger, I heard the analogy one time of, you don't put a flower out in the middle of a field by itself, and that's what children are, right? They're these flowers. What happens to a flower that's just put in the middle of the field by itself? Well, it's gonna take some beatings.
Yeah.
And so you want to protect that flower. And so what happens when you're that child that encountered some things when you're younger? It's unmistakable. It's in your DNA now, and you can see it, and you can smell it.
Yeah.
Now you made a choice at some point, right, Brian, to say, what is this going to do? Am I going to be the kid who's always kind of complaining about this?
Yeah.
You didn't, so I think you and I could share some stories about that, or what happens when you're young and you hit some trauma. And that's a whole nother kind of level of perspective.
It's and I have very, very conscious memories, and people that have two parents don't think about this, but I remember, my dad was in the military after my mom died. And I remember when he would leave for work, I consciously remember thinking when I was 12 or 13, please God, let my dad come home, because I don't want to be an orphan. Now I only have one parent. Right.
Wow.
And I remember worrying about that, but I'll tell you what else I remember. I remember thinking very consciously again, that I was going to prove to people that somebody that was raised by a single father could be just as successful as somebody that was raised by two parents or raised by a mother. And so for me, it was kind of, it was a lot of the fuel that drove me to do what I do. But anyway.
How old were you when you decided that, when you kind of made a conscious decision?
I think I was, it's funny you'd ask me that, because I'll tell you exactly. So what used to happen, when I grew up, it was me and my brother, who was 8, I was 10. And then my dad adopted one of his black students, General. He lived with us. So it was basically 4 boys in the house when I was in high school. There was never any food in the house, and the house was clean, but there wasn't a bunch of nice stuff. But I remember my friends would come over and their moms would pack little lunches or dinners for them, and my dad would get so upset with that, because he'd be like, these moms, they don't think a dad can raise a kid on his own. And I remember thinking, I'm going to prove to him that that's not true.
That's great. That's great. That's special.
Yeah. So very, 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 very conscious. But then when I get to A&M, of course, when we have parents weekend, the tradition is your mother pins a rose on your uniform. And I was one of 4 or 5 cadets that didn't have a mom to do that. And so Carol Ray used to pin a white rose on my lapel. And, that sometimes when people hear that, it sounds a little sad, but actually I always really enjoyed that, because it made me appreciate Carol, number one, who's basically, I consider her like one of the women who almost raised me in a way. But anyway, it's interesting how these traumatic experiences, we've all had traumatic experiences in our life. They can shape you in good ways. They can shape you in bad ways.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure people that come back from war that don't do very well when they get back.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of those.
Yeah. So what are you thinking about the next 2, 3, 4 months? I mean, you started a business, and the economy is, who knows what's going to happen, the protests, elections. I mean, what are you thinking over the next 3 or 4 months?
You mean for what am I going to do? How am I going to, what's my strategy?
Yeah. Like, what's your mentality? I mean, you literally started a business in the middle of a pandemic.
And I tell you that, you talk again, we're back into that role of, this is a terrible idea. I had it so good before. It was so, I'm going to keep coming back to this, because I believe in the story of Bilbo Baggins and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the archetype hero, all the people you've had on your podcast, which I think is a remarkable thing that you're doing, Brian. The people who've gone outside the cave, either pulled out, called out, or pushed out. What have they come back to tell us? What have they come back to tell us different from being out there? The Luke Skywalker. What did you learn when you came back from that? And it's sometimes hard to articulate, but the bottom line is this, is that there is something higher than what you see in front of you. You have to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
The love you have for another human being, can't touch it, can't smell it, but you can see it.
For sure. No doubt.
But it's not something you can grab hold of. So I would say it starts there, Brian. It really starts with that idea. And I think the more people decide, I need to go outside of my domesticity. I need to get out. I need to take some chances.
Yeah.
And again, that's dependent on your lot in life, right? So, don't say I'm going to go, I'm going to go conquer a world. Well, obviously that's not the right idea, but there's little things you can do to get out. And I honestly think if And I challenge myself that all the time, Brian. I think, am I getting too cozy here?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you're always moving. It just means, and I don't like to use the word challenge myself, but am I doing what I need to be doing?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great saying, the cave you fear to enter holds the gold you seek.
I like that.
Yeah. I read that 2 or 3 months ago, and it really stuck with me because, for instance, this podcast is a great example. I was nervous about doing this. And
Yeah.
I was like, just like you, I was like, this is the stupidest idea ever. There's already a million podcasts. Who's going to listen to this? I mean, nobody wants to listen to Brian Beckham talk on a podcast.
Yeah.
And I was like, just like you, I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. This is crazy. This is crazy. And then I just did it. I was just like, screw it. I'll just do it. And it's almost like when you have that voice saying, ooh, you better be careful. You better not do that. You might fail. It's almost like that's exactly when you know that's what you should be doing.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think your intellect knows this is a bad idea. I shouldn't do this, or something's trying to pull me down. Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
But I think that we're at an interesting time right now because some people have enjoyed the pandemic a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But no one's enjoying what's going on with the racial issues right now. I don't think anybody's enjoying that. So it is it's interesting to see how all this is going to play out in people's homes, and that's where it starts, right? I mean, that's where anything we talked about, it starts in the home, how to deal with these things.
So you said something about love. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but I mean, it's real.
It's real.
Right? And I would say, like, my working hypothesis for the last year or so has been the most powerful thing in the world, and the most powerful thing in human history. It's always been the most powerful thing in the world, is the power of ideas.
Yeah.
And you can't touch an idea, you can't feel it, you can't smell an idea. But when people get these ideas in their head and they spread, that can be very, very positive, or it can be very, very negative. And so, one of the things I've tried to do with this podcast is spread as much positivity as I can, try to get positive ideas out in the world, because Lord knows we have plenty of negativity. And I just want to say, I really appreciate all of your positivity, not just on this podcast, but I'm telling listeners right now, Toby is the kind of guy that if you're talking to him within 30 seconds, you're going to have a huge smile on your face, because he's either going to do something dumb or he's going to tell you a great joke. So Toby, I've kept you over the time that you that I said we would go, but before I let you go, I got just a couple questions I want to ask you. I know you like to read.
Mm-hmm.
And so give us a couple book recommendations. Like what are some of the books that you've really either had an impact on you, been reading recently that you've really enjoyed?
So, I'll tell you this, if you haven't read St. Augustine, The Confessions, it's a great story. It's probably one of the greatest minds, and just bracket religion for a second, right? Just bracket that this guy ended up becoming a saint. Probably one of the greatest philosophers in Western, society. Roughly, I think 300 AD, 700 AD, I believe. But that's a book that you need to read. It's a story of a man that spent the prodigal son life, and articulates that kind of process of going out of the cave.
There's another book that you recommended to me that I think is a great recommendation. And I think it's called God and Man in Russia, or Finding God in Russia. Do you remember that?
Oh
book?
My goodness!
Not a great.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
Walter Ciszek. Okay, yeah. Thank you for reminding me that. If there's any book you want to read to kind of get you some perspective on keeping things important, it's that. It's In Russia with God.
In Russia with God. That's right. And as I recall, it's about a preacher.
Yes.
Who lived there during a very, very bad time, where preachers were subject to imprisonment or death or all sorts of things.
Close. So real quick history. He was an American-born Polish priest, and he wanted to take an adventure. He wanted to go preach in Russia.
Yeah.
Well, he went there, and that's before World War II broke out, and he ended up kind of making some deals and went across the border and got caught and spent, I believe, the next, 30 years in the Russian prisons.
Yeah. Yeah. I just got done reading Gulag Archipelago, which is pretty
That's a good book.
Pretty chilling. It's about the Gulag system
Yeah.
in Soviet Russia, and the way the guy writes the book is so matter of fact that it's just there's no embellishment necessary.
Yeah.
It's kind of, and I've been trying to read books like this a little bit just to get a little perspective on kind of what we're going through right now. So, last question, Toby. I think I'm gonna have you put your Lieutenant Colonel Marine Corps hat back on, and I'm going to ask you to tell the listeners who are having trouble right now, whatever it may be, whether it's having trouble with their job and their income, having trouble with the pandemic or stuff like that, worried, nervous. What do you tell them?
I'd say all bad things will pass.
Yeah. Well put, Marine. Well, Toby, thank you for giving me a little extra time. Like I said, you're one of the best guys I've ever met. I'm really glad that we're friends. I wish we got to see each other a little bit more often.
Yeah.
Tell your family I said hi.
Likewise. Took care. We said hi.
Hi, brother. I miss you.
All right, brother. Okay.
You've been listening to Lessons from Leaders with Brian Beckham. If you've enjoyed this week's interview, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast and keep up with the latest episodes. You can also connect with Brian through his firm at vbattorneys.com.